Hello everyone, and welcome back to our discussion on Europe in transition. So in the previous videos for this unit, we've been talking about Romanticism, this movement in literature where writing is very much idealized, right? We romanticize things, meaning we make them appear better than they actually are. But now we're going to move on to our next literary movement within this era of Europe in transition, and that is going to be realism. So as we're going through our discussion of realism, there's going to be three key things that we're seeking to learn and understand. And the first is understanding the development and characteristics of realism. So how it came about as a literary movement within the context of a political and historical movement, but also what key characteristics define realism as a literary movement. We're then going to discuss the differences between Romanticism, so what we just learned, Realism, what we'll be focusing on in this part of the unit, and then Naturalism, which is going to come after Realism. And then finally, we're going to put our knowledge to the test by reading and analyzing a key piece of realistic literature. Beginning our look at realism then, we see that it begins around 1840, so again, picking up right as Romanticism ends. And the whole point of realism as a movement, not only in literature but in art, by the way, is this desire to show life as it really is. So think about how you would post on Instagram or TikTok, right? You might enjoy using filters and cropping the picture and changing it to make it appear better than it did when you first took it. This would be an example of Romanticism. Right? When we talk about realism, realism is going to be then taking that photo and instead of cropping it and altering it and putting filters on it, posting it exactly the way that it appears, right? Giving this realistic image to life. Hence why we call this movement realism. And realism then is going to be a reaction to two things. So the first thing it's going to react to is the Industrial Revolution. And we talked about this when we were unpacking Romanticism. But realism is going to respond to the Industrial Revolution in terms of the negative qualities that it brings with it, right? So some of the great things about the Industrial Revolution is that now, rather than having to slave for hours creating one nice product, right, we can simply create machines to make hundreds of them in the same amount of time. And while this is good for production, this comes at the cost of human labor and very awful human living conditions, as we're going to unpack in a moment. So realism sought to basically pull back that idealized image that we have of the Industrial Revolution and show the dark underbelly that actually existed. And the second thing that realism reacts to is, again, that idealism and sentimentality of Romanticism, right? Whereas the Romantics would have looked at a tortured and brooding soul as something romantic, right? Realism would have looked at that character and looked at their faults and portrayed them not as something to be idealized or achieved, but as something to perhaps pity. And just as we did with Romanticism, we're going to go through certain historical and political developments that really shaped the way that realistic authors looked at the world around them and translated that into their literature. And the first thing that we need to look at is what we're going to call the development of nations. And remember, we talked about Romanticism, we talked about a number of events in European history and how you had this rise of people standing up and fighting for themselves and looking out for the individual. Now we're going to see that this continues, right? So on the heels of the French Revolution and this idea of people banding together and speaking up for themselves as a country, we get this idea of nationalism. And nationalism is simply the belief that people who share a common culture and history make up a nation, right? Say someone is a nationalist, meaning that they love their country, they love their culture and the history that's made up their nation. So this, again, is something that's unleashed by the French Revolution. People have taken these rebellious revolts and ideas and they've run with them. And it's also going to continue to spark a number of different revolutions within this new time period, but now we're looking at it among certain ethnic groups. So remember, back in this time period, you had empires that ruled over a great portion of the world. Think of the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, right? And so in this area of realism, in this time period, right, in the late 19th centuries, where we begin to see the demise of these empires as different ethnic groups, rather than submitting to the rule of a foreign authority, rise up together to promote their own self-rule. And on the heels of this, right, we also have imperialism. So nationalism, then, we're going to define as people believing in the common culture and history they share with people from their nation. Imperialism is going to be something widely different. So with the Industrial Revolution and this idea that I can produce things faster, quickly, right? We have a new drive for raw materials, right? They're going through them faster. And geographically, the way this works is that certain raw materials you're not going to be able to find in Europe. Right? So this leads to European nations, right? Primarily Britain and France. And they are going to go into places like Africa and Asia to find these materials, right? But rather than trading for them, right, they are going to instill instead imperialism. And imperialism we define as this process of taking over and dominating another country. And the drive for that in the late 19th century is this need for raw materials to feed the Industrial Revolution. So this is going to be a good thing for the Europeans, obviously, because their wealth is going to increase as they begin to produce more products and export those products. But this is going to come at the cost of the colonies, the people who they then dominate control over. So it's this very interesting dynamic we have going on. So on the one hand, this rise of nationalism and certain countries fighting for their freedom, but on the other hand, right, this oppressive imperialism where Europe, because of the drive of the Industrial Revolution, seeks to gain control over other nations for their raw goods. Again, continuing that train of thought in the Industrial Revolution, because that is going to be one of the primary things we look at in terms of realism, right? We see that industrialism changes the way that people do work. So again, you're able to work faster, you produce more in the same amount of time, but you also can produce things more cheaply because rather than simply relying on human hands, you're relying on human hands in combination with machines. So for example, you can make these inexpensive clothes that prior, right, were very expensive because people are taking their time and doing them by hand without the assistance of machinery. So now you have this, right? And this is going to be a huge benefit primarily for the middle class, right? Think about the upper class. They already have access to these things, you guys, right? By means of their wealth. But the middle class, right? They're going to be able to access these same nice, fine quality things for a much more reasonable cost. But the cost then, right, not just in terms of money, but in terms of labor, is going to be borne by the lower class. These are going to be the people who are slaving for hours and hours a day in the industrial manufactories, right, to be able to produce these things for the middle class. And this is where we come to the heart of the problem with the Industrial Revolution and what realism is going to seek to address. And that is the terrible and horrible living conditions that these lower class workers were made to live under. You guys, they would work for 12 hours a day, non-stop, very little in terms of food and water and proper provision. They would have had to work under extremely dangerous conditions. It wouldn't have been something uncommon, right, to hear of someone losing a finger, losing a limb, or even losing their life. Because these factories, their primary concern wasn't the safety of their workers. It was getting to produce as much as they could because that's where they turned a profit. And so people are going to look at this, people who desire reform, and they're going to say that this is unacceptable, that we can't put up with this. So several laws then are passed to help make the environment safer. So one, giving more reasonable working hours. They're still very long, right? But now you would have breaks. You'd have unions that are formed to help protect the rights of these workers. But also, you have a crackdown on child labor. So for many of you, right, averaging your age around 16, 17, right? You would have already been working in these factories if you're from a lower class family, oftentimes by the age of 9, because your family can't afford to send you to school. So if you're not going to go to school, the best thing for you to do is then to go and work in these factories, 12 hours a day, working to make money for your family. But people begin to see the importance of education. So you have the rise of free public education being offered as a reform movement in an effort to make people responsible for child labor, right? It's not the job of a child to be working in a factory. They need to be in school. And so this was made in an effort to stop that. Even though, however, right, you do have these reforms. I'm not saying that they were bad. They're incredibly good. But they're still not enough because you're going to have a number of children who are still not able to access proper education. So by now, the main theme you should be beginning to see, right, is that we're no longer talking about the world in these romantic terms. We're talking about it in very dark black and white terms. Another thing that we see in terms of realism, right, is in that scientific breakthrough. And this is going to revolutionize people's lives. The turn of the 20th century, right, so getting into the late 1800s into the early 1900s is incredibly interesting in terms of science, because now you have the rise of electricity. People can now have lighting in their home. You have the rise of the telephone, the automobile, and specifically for science, and those who are interested in biology in particular, you have one key figure that your book is going to highlight, and that is going to be Louis Pasteur. And he is going to be responsible for discovering the fact that bacteria cause disease. Right? Something that we take for granted now, but that back then wouldn't have been something widely realized. And this is going to be vastly important in terms of leading to a development of vaccines for a number of serious diseases, typhoid fever being one of them. So we can be very thankful for the fact that we have vaccines, that we're able to even now begin to work on a vaccine for COVID-19, right? Because of the groundwork that was laid during this period. Now that we've talked about the history, we're going to move into understanding realism as a literary movement, because that's what we're here to discuss, right? So what is realism then? Understanding the history that realism is reacting to, primarily the Industrial Revolution, we're going to see that realism is an accurate portrayal of life. So they're going to deal with these daily struggles and disappointments of ordinary people. So we're no longer talking about these lofty romantic heroes. We're going to talk about ordinary people and the daily problems that they go through. And this is in large part going to be because we're looking at realism as rebellion against Romanticism. So realist writers would have looked at Romanticism and said that it's far too emotional and idealistic. Life doesn't always end happily. You don't always get what you want. Again, it's going to be influenced by real-world changes. So as the Industrial Revolution kicks up, as you have these different movements of nationalism and imperialism, it's going to look at the world and how it changes and use that in its writing. But primarily, it's going to focus on the lower class. Other characteristics of realism that we need to pay attention to is one, that you have a new kind of subject matter. So romantic writers would have glorified the individual, right? Think of Faust, right? It glorifies in its journey the idea that Faust longs for knowledge greater than what he has and how that is a good thing. Realistic writers, however, are going to look for an understanding of their time, meaning looking at the world around them, pointing out its flaws, its disappointments, its struggles, and trying to understand what we can learn from that. So you're still focusing on the individual life, but you're not romanticizing it any longer. So for example, you're going to have a lot of people writing about peasants, businessmen, housewives, ordinary characters, not larger than life characters. And additionally, you're going to have the upper class characters portrayed with a variety of faults. Right? They're no longer idealized in terms of they're the upper class. They must be viewed as romantic and beautiful, right? No, they point out their flaws. And you're also going to have a closer examination of character, meaning your morals and your ethics and your moral behavior. So why characters do what they do, and is it moral? Is it ethical? And additionally, in this idea of a new subject matter, you're going to have a new view on life. So rather than the romantic idea that everything always works out in the end for the best, that the character always gets the girl, right? This is not going to be the case. And a primary example of this, right, is John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, which you read about, okay? Technically, it's going to come after, much later, right, during the 1920s, whereas we have realism beginning in the 1840s, but still, it's this idea that's heavily influenced in realism, whereas the characters, right, they don't get a happy ending. George and Lenny do not get the ending that we longed for and hoped for them. And a big part of why that is, which we discussed in class, is that Steinbeck wants to create this realistic view of the American dream, not a romanticized view where everyone gets what they want. Now, along with that change in subject matter and a new view on life, we're also going to have a change in the method, meaning the way that people write. So, whereas the writings of Romantics was very emotional and imaginative, right? Think back to Faust, now how we had a plethora of examples of not just the supernatural, but this very emotional, heart-wrenching writing. Realistic writers are going to do something extremely different, and they're going to approach their writing more scientifically. So as if you're observing something, you're writing about it, but you're not emotionally invested. You're detached, right? So rather than having this pull to idealize characters, you're going to describe them with facts, right? Think about it almost in the sense of how you would write a scientific report. You're trying to tell the facts. You're not trying to dress it up and make it appear nicer than it actually is. So with that, I'd like to do a small practice. So I put in two excerpts on the right side of your screen, and we want to read through them and try to accurately define which one is romantic and which is realistic. So let's read through the first example together. They were no longer living men and troops, but a dream drifting in a fog, a mystery, mourners parading under the black sky. Now, if you've been paying even a little bit of attention, this should clearly ring out to you as romantic, right? Because we know from some key words that they're talking about war, right? Men, troops, parading. So they're going off to battle, to war, which is something very grim in reality. But the author here is couching it in diction, meaning word choice, that is extremely romantic, right? They're walking through this dream, through a fog, through a mystery, right? Making it seem more idealized than war actually is. So this one we would pin as romantic, right? Meaning the next one obviously is realistic. But let's take a look at that example and see why this is realistic. Then a wagon passed at the jerky trot of a nag, shaking strangely, two men seated side by side, and a woman in the bottom of the vehicle, the latter holding on to the sides to lessen the hard jolts. So here you have this image of three people sitting in a wagon. So this, you can think of it as a large open air sort of trunk, if you will, made out of wood, right? That would have been pulled behind by horses. And so they're describing this scene very realistically, right? So you have these two men who are sitting on one side, they're sitting next to one another, and you have a woman who's sitting towards the bottom, towards the back, and that she's holding on to the sides of the wagon to try to lessen the jerking and jolting movements, right? There's nothing romanticized about that, right? Because we can clearly understand that these characters are not enjoying this ride in the back of the wagon. So looking beyond realism now, we're going to talk about naturalism for a moment. And naturalism is going to be this next movement that develops out of realism. So one of the key ways then we can differentiate realism and naturalism is the fact that realism is going to focus on the concerns of the character, whereas naturalism is going to focus on the concerns of the plot. So for example, it's going to portray human life as being determined by these outside forces. So the main focus isn't what happens to the character, but the world around them, the plot, how it moves, and how things outside of the control of the characters really determine the plot and what happens to them. So for example, writing that talks about our heredity, or the environment around us, how these things control what happened to us, and that we really have this great lack of control. Émile Zola, a French author, is a prime example of this, and he writes a series of novels wherein the central characters, right, have these things happen to them that are far and above outside their control. Nana is an example of this. I placed the cover to your right, and it talks about this central character who begins life as a prostitute, a woman on the streets, and how she tries to rise and to be more than she really was, right? But ultimately, how her upbringing, how her environment really drags her back down. Looking then at the three different movements that we've focused on, noting that naturalism is not something we're going to read, but it's very important to know in terms of how Romanticism and Realism eventually evolve into naturalism. So to do this, we're going to have one more exercise, and it's called 3 Ways of Looking at a Sparrow. You can find this in your textbook, by the way, on page 943, and I've placed it verbatim here. So each of these point of views is going to talk about the same sparrow that I've given to you on the right, but it's going to talk about it in the method of that movement. So let's look at the romantic point of view first. Behold the small sparrow, so small, so innocent. Such gifts that nature brings make me glad to see tomorrow. So again, you have that focus on the individual. It's still going back to the person who's speaking. But now it talks about the sparrow in these romantic terms, right? So small and innocent, talking about the sparrow as a gift that nature gives to mankind. Next, we have realism. The sparrow searches for food. He hops around, looking under leaves, picking at twigs, cocking his head to listen for danger. So here the sparrow then is treated as that central character, but it's treated as a character in terms of fact. So the fact being that this sparrow is looking for food, and that as he goes around, he's hopping, he's looking under leaves, picking up twigs, moving his head, listening for danger. So again, the focus is realistic, but focused on the sparrow as a character. And then finally, we have the naturalist point of view. The sparrow is quick, but not quick enough. The hawk swoops, capturing its prey in its strong talons. So here, rather than the focus being the character of the sparrow, the focus is the plot, meaning what happens to my sparrow. And naturalist point of view, right, especially in this example, you can think of it almost in terms of like the Animal Planet, right? Or if you watch Planet Earth, the way in which the narrator describes what's happening is a very naturalist point of view, right, coming from nature. And finally, just one last thing I want to do is to discuss these strategies for reading. So they're going to look very similar in a lot of the movements we talk about, right? Because reading literature and unlocking our understanding relies on these things. So the first thing we need to do is to pay attention to certain concrete details for information about the characters and the setting. The next thing we want to do is to notice the values that the characters have, and whether some of their values seem to contradict one another. This is going to be especially true in our focus for this movement, which is How Much Land Does a Man Need by Leo Tolstoy. Next, we need to determine what causes a character's downfall. Because remember, in realism, we're talking about life realistically. So we're not going to get the happy ending that we want. Also, we're going to look for those truths about ordinary life. Right? Just as we're talking about factual things, realistic things, we want to learn something about the way the author views simple life. And finally, continue to use and monitor with those reading strategies we talked about in the very beginning of the year. That is going to be it for video number 23. In our next video, we're going to unpack the life of our author, Leo Tolstoy, and giving more background information on his short story, How Much Land Does a Man Need? Looking specifically at how we determine theme in fiction and how, as we read, we can draw conclusions to better help our understanding of the text. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.